So, kicking off a series of short little videos talking about the regional dynamics, looking at problems the United States is facing and how it's managed its foreign policy in different regions over time. I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about US Chinese relations and how that has shifted over the last 20 or 30 years. And so, maybe the place to pick this up is at the end of the Cold War. During the second half of the Cold War, the United States and China had achieved some sort of strategic cooperation. Both were wary to borderline hostile toward the Soviet Union, and they worked together in the second half of the Cold War. But once the Cold War ends, that partnership, not necessarily alliance, but that partnership between the United States and China suddenly sort of is open to question. What's holding it together? There's no need to balance the Soviet Union, and new issues arise that create real concerns for both the United States and for China. China thinking about its place in the world, and the United States looking at China's behavior, particularly with the Tiananmen Square massacres, in which college students protesting for greater political reform and democratic voice are essentially crushed in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign waged against more or less the whole of Beijing. And the Clinton administration is faced in the early 1990s with sort of the question about what's the way forward with this new partnership, or this new situation for this sort of rocky partnership. And Clinton opts for a strategy of engagement. He opts for connecting with China economically, remaining cooperative with China, even though he's sort of conflicted about the human rights atrocities and abuses that are being committed by the Chinese government. When Bush Jr. takes office, his policy toward China remains similar in that he is also focused on engagement and helps to usher China into the World Trade Organization, a move that the Clinton administration had sort of paved the way for. But a lot of the concerns that the Bush administration or that the Clinton administration had, really weren't there in the Bush administration. The thinking was China is a strategic partner. There are lots of opportunities for cooperation, and the best thing that the United States can do is to cooperate with China on those areas of strategic cooperation. The Obama administration takes a slightly, no, moderately to strongly different approach. Not conflict, not looking for to drive a wedge between the United States and China, but taking the view that China is very much in a different situation than it was when either Clinton or Bush Jr. were thinking about the strategic relationship with the United States. China has gained ground, is now an essential state for solving many global problems. The United States can't make progress on climate change, on dealing with the fallout of the Great Recession, dealing with piracy in the Indian Ocean without cooperation with China. And there's this dynamic of interdependence that's emerged through the United States and China's deep trading partnerships, but there's also emerging strategic rivalry. And so the Obama administration pushes through a policy that we've talked about, the pivot to Asia, where the Obama administration is looking to prepare itself to constrain China's ambitions with the hope that that will create space for continued cooperation. The Trump administration takes a much more adversarial policy and essentially tries to unwind 2 decades of cooperation and economic interdependence, essentially trying to burn down those economic relationships that essentially link the United States and China together. And I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that China's position in the world has very much changed. And as China's position in the world has very much changed, their ambitions and how those have been understood by their neighbors have changed as well. And so during the first part of the post-Cold War period, Chinese leaders have sort of this built-in incentive to downplay their ambitions, right? They want to participate in the global economy. They want to be part of a system of cooperation. And so they make the case that China really doesn't have grievances, doesn't have ambitions in the world. It's a status quo power, interested in cooperation without conflict, but sort of undergirding that is an understanding that sort of the underlying trends of China growing at 10% a year, having 1.5 billion people, are going to eventually sort of reverse the fortunes of the global system, so that China will be the great power or even the dominant power of the future. But things haven't changed yet. And so there's a built-in incentive for China to sort of bide its time. And that period of maybe waiting and downplaying ambition, really, I think I mark coming to an end when Xi Jinping becomes the head of of the People's Republic of China in 2012. His selection is accompanied with a really ramping up of hardline nationalist rhetoric and increasing criticism of the West. I did some development work in China and worked with Chinese universities and as part of a State Department grant. And in 2014, 2015, people kept talking about this chill, this change in the relationship that was filtering down to universities, where Xi Jinping had sort of indicated that there's too much Western influence and universities need to withdraw some of their cooperation with the United States. And I think the biggest flashpoint that we've seen on this has been China's actions in the South China Sea. And so if this isn't on your radar, I'm going to give you a really quick overview of what's going on. So typically the way that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea works is that countries are able to claim 2 to 10 miles off their coast as their territorial waters that they get to control and say, you know, I control who goes into this area. This is sort of my security zone and an extension of my territory. And then you can go out 200 miles, and that's sort of that dotted blue line on the map. You can go out 200 miles from your coast, and that is your exclusive economic zones. So your country has the right to fish. Your country has the right to, you know, draw minerals or drill for oil or natural gas in that zone. And any other country that wants to extract resources from that zone needs to cooperate with you. But it's also a zone in which you can have sort of freedom of navigation. So you can sail through those exclusive economic zones without having to ask permission to enter somebody else's territory. And the dispute that draws in, you know, the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam, and there's other disputes with Japan and South Korea, is that China has essentially claimed the dashed red line as its territorial waters. So not exclusive economic zone, but as territorial waters, an extension of China's territory that China is able to control who goes into. And this has been an ongoing point of conflict between the United States and China, where the United States regularly sails military vessels through this region as what are known as freedom of navigation operations, to demonstrate that while China might claim that these are territorial waters, the United States retains the ability to essentially transit that region at will as a way to demonstrate that no, it actually is open to free navigation of the seas. Similarly, there's been disputes around islands, and China has actually found an innovative strategy to claim essentially an entire sea by using the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They'll take sort of sandbars or islands that are sort of sitting below the ocean surface, and China will pile up sand and dredge it up from the bottom of the ocean, pile it up, cement it in place with concrete, and build structures on it, and then say, well, this is now our territory. And if you build enough of those different fake islands, you're essentially able to create a perimeter that you can extend out and say, well, these are my territorial waters around these islands that I control, and essentially create a de facto reality on the ground by way of building islands. And so this has created tremendous conflict between China and its neighbors, and the United States has a vested interest in this conflict, in part because of US concern over freedom of navigation. I really can't underestimate how big a sort of flashpoint this is in terms of Asian and Southeast Asian and East Asian relations, because most of the countries in that region are very much island powers. And what I mean by that is that they don't face any serious threat of invasion by land. When they think about their security, they think about their security in terms of an invasion by sea, in terms of controlling waterways, in terms of protecting islands. And so many of the countries in this region have islands they have to defend, or are islands that essentially they control. And so there has been a massive naval buildup over the last decade or so, in which Japan has essentially created aircraft carriers for for jets that can sort of take off vertically, converting what had been essentially helipads into de facto aircraft carriers. India has gotten aircraft carriers. China has gotten aircraft carriers. Taiwan and Vietnam have invested heavily in attack submarines or destroyers. All of this trying to gain some sort of naval advantage in terms of security, because that's really where a lot of the game is in terms of, I say game in terms of, playing, but game in terms of strategic dynamic in Southeast Asia. And a lot of military planners on the American side and then elsewhere have talked about the plausibility, the possibility that there might be an air-sea war in the Pacific, in which the United States and China experience a confrontation that remains confined to planes, missiles, and naval craft. And because it doesn't threaten sort of invasion of land, there's the thinking that whoever wins this air-sea battle will achieve naval superiority and will essentially retain superiority in the region. And it doesn't have to involve an actual ground invasion, which would threaten a country's survival and potentially, escalate to nuclear confrontation. This is a really dangerous sort of line of rationale to go down, because conflicts like this tend to ratchet up and not down very easily. Both the United States and China have been preparing aggressively over the last decade for potentially a preemptive strike built around this idea of air-sea warfare. And lastly, I want to sort of flag what I think has been the grand debate in U.S. foreign policy and some of the logic of it and some of the problems with it. And so the grand debate has been, if the United States engages with China, draws China into this global system of trade and cooperation, will that lead to a political reform in China? And will a political reform, a democratization, I guess, will that then translate into increased peacefulness and create a foundation for long-term cooperation between the United States and China? And the logic behind that is that engagement with the rest of the world through trade and through investment and through international organizations is going to change China in certain ways. That as China becomes wealthier, its population is going to want to engage more with the rest of the world. It's going to travel more. It's going to have access to the internet with fewer controls through VPN and other technologies. The act of integrating into the global economy is going to force China to be more transparent with information, possibly navigate a free press, possibly reform itself internally to improve the rule of law so that companies can function, within China. And that technologies like the internet will be just sort of beyond China's ability to control, and will create space for people to organize and mobilize, and therefore push for political reform within China. And I think that all of these sort of assumptions about how engagement and technology are going to change China have largely been, I don't want to say shown to be not correct, but haven't been as effective as I think the cheerleaders for engagement had thought. That what we have seen in China has been greater political activism around human rights and environmental movements. And that's possible because of the rising standards of living and the rising wealth. And the Chinese government has tolerated that to some extent, as long as those movements don't actually threaten the regime itself. That when the regime itself comes under threat, China's been very aggressive in breaking and cracking open those kind of movements that were sort of anticipated, those social movements that were kind of anticipated. And part of this is that there's really an imbalance in China between while China's a very wealthy country in many respects and has a large population that has very good living standards, there's also a large chunk of China that is really struggling economically and really hasn't seen those standards of living rise. And so the idea that a social movement within China will be leaning toward a middle class revolution, asking for greater political voice, I think is probably incorrect, that what we end up seeing is we see a lot of protest and we see a lot of uprising and we see a lot of complaints from the sort of poor and I want to say left behind, but the lesser developed parts of China, sort of advocating that they need a greater share of China's wealth and prosperity, and that's a much bigger chunk of the population, much bigger share where we've seen activism. The idea that markets are somehow going to force China to be more transparent really hasn't played out, I would say, in any realistic sense. International investors have been more than happy to participate in the Chinese market just because the market is so big, because the promise of success in China is so great. And international investors and multinational corporations have made huge concessions, giving China unparalleled powers over corporate governance and technology to gain access to those Chinese markets. And so from my view, we haven't really seen corporations driving reform in China the way that I think cheerleaders had anticipated we would. And then lastly, the idea that technology is going to sort of be too powerful for any country to control is just simply not the case. China's been very effective at controlling the internet, monitoring social media, pushing back through AI, but also pushing back just through legions of college students who monitor message boards and are there to maybe direct conversations away from criticism of the Chinese government, that while there's far more information available to people than ever there was before, the Chinese government has been reasonably effective at managing how that information operates and what is available to people, and has used that to its advantage over the years.